will participate in that. So we'll continue on with the section on psychotherapy. In particular, where we'll pick it up is with the subsection on the process of psychotherapy. Hello and welcome to Miracles on High Plains. My name is Jonica, and our reader today is Julie C.
Psychotherapy is a process that changes the view of the self. At best, this new self is a more beneficent self-concept, but psychotherapy can hardly be expected to establish reality. This is not its function. If it can make way for reality, it has achieved its ultimate success. Its whole function in the end is to help the patient deal with one fundamental error, the belief that anger brings him something he really wants, and that by justifying attack, he is protecting himself. To whatever extent he comes to realize that this is an error, to that extent, he is truly saved.
Mm-hmm. So this is intended as a review, so we're going to go a little bit faster than we did yesterday. Two major points here. Psychotherapy is a process that changes the view of the self. A Course of Miracles is a curriculum that changes the view of the self. Very compatible. And two, the whole function of the therapeutic process is to undo a confusion or an error called here the fundamental error, and it means the most important error of them all. And it's explained here as an error that where someone believes that they are being threatened externally and therefore justified in attacking back, defending themselves and attacking back. We'll elaborate on this a little bit more in just a moment, because understanding the fundamental error is the only way to undo the fundamental error. So you must understand it and then recognize that it's not true, and forgive that thought and let it be replaced by the Holy Spirit's teachings, which we'll explore. That will come along with a new sense of self-concept. Julie?
Patients do not enter the therapeutic relationship with this goal in mind. On the contrary, such concepts mean little to them, or they would not need help. Their aim is to be able to retain their self-concept exactly as it is, but without the suffering that it entails. Their whole equilibrium rests on the insane belief that this is possible. And because to the sane mind, it is so clearly impossible, what they seek is magic. In illusions, the impossible is easily accomplished, but only at the cost of making illusions true. The patient has already paid this price. Now he wants a better illusion.
Mm-hmm. And so we have some dissonance here in a therapeutic relation. The patient enters in not with the idea of changing their self-concept. What they want is for the pain and suffering to go away, for them to be able to retain their self-concept, but they want to be happy with it. Whereas the way to healing is to relinquish their self-concept. And the helper or therapist who understands the true nature of the error is there to help them change their self-concept. And so you've got some dissonance because the patient hasn't agreed to a new self-concept, even though that's the path to their healing. And so this has to be negotiated, this difference between the goal the therapist has for the patient and the goal that the patient has for themselves. Julie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a 12-step colleague, and she would describe this as the difference between wanting to get better versus wanting to feel better.
Okay, and I think if I'm understanding you right, just to feel better is to keep everything, basically my old structure in place, but just feel better with it. And to get better would be to undergo a real deeper process of healing.
Right. And that's, hopefully the message that effective helpers are able to offer, right?
Yes, indeed. And so let's talk about application. What's this have to do with A Course in Miracles? It has everything to do with A Course in Miracles because many people enter into this program because they heard it might help them find peace and it was effective for other people. But they don't come in with an idea of let me get rid of my self concept and have my entire self concept that I've built up over years and years of life. I'm ready to get rid of it. Most people do not come in with the idea that we're just going to relinquish all that. Instead, they come in with the idea, I want to be happy. I want to be at peace. So help me with that. All right. Julie, I'm going to put your hand down there. So again, this is intended to be a review. We did cover this yesterday. I strongly encourage those of you that did not have the opportunity to join in yesterday's session to review that video so that you have a solid foundation of what we're discussing here.
Everyone who needs help, regardless of the form of his distress, is attacking himself, and his peace of mind is suffering in consequence. These tendencies are often described as self-destructive, and the patient often regards them in that way himself. What he does not realize and needs to learn is that this self, which can attack it, and is sometimes even willing to sacrifice his life on its behalf, for he regards it as himself. This self he sees as being acted on, reacting to external forces as they demand, and helpless midst the power of the world. The whole function of psychotherapy, in the end, is to help the patient deal with one fundamental error: the belief that anger brings him something he really wants, and that by justifying attack, he is protecting himself. To whatever extent he comes to realize that this is an error, to that extent, he is truly saved.
Mm-hmm. So if I could, I would bold everything in this paragraph. This is critical that you understand this paragraph because it describes better, perhaps than anywhere else, the one fundamental error that you and I, and we assert all people have done. And in simple terms, it's this. Throughout the first formative years of our life, we piece together an idea of ourself, a self concept. It was an imperfect process. It was very much based on the time and circumstances and situation of our life. And it was done without a sense of infinite love in the formulating of that self concept. And then what happens is the ego looks at that self concept and finds it unacceptable, not unlovable, not desirable, inadequate, deficient. And so the attack of your own self concept comes from within your mind. This is critical. I know people don't necessarily grasp that this is what's happening, but you at least try to understand the proposal here. What's being said is that within your own mind, you find your own self-concept to be unlovable and therefore judge against it critically. People kill themselves over matters such as this. Or else, then part B, the corollary of that attacking oneself and finding oneself unlovable, is because that's so uncomfortable, it becomes easier and more convenient to project the attack outward towards others and towards the world and towards life itself. And thus the mind becomes weaponized as a device for attack, both externally and internally. And it seems to the ego mind that all this is rightly so, justified attack, that this makes perfect sense. After all, these self concepts are unlovable. And so, what shall we say about that then? Let's review what they just said. Regardless of the form of the patient's distress, he is attacking himself, and his peace of mind suffers about this, from this. He needs to learn that this self, which is attacked and being attacked, is a concept that his own mind made up. This is not the self that God created. This is a self that we believe, fabricated and cobbled together based on our experiences here in time. So therefore, the whole function of healing and psychotherapy is to help the patient deal with this fundamental error. And it's the belief that all the emotions and the anger and the disdain towards the self-concepts, the belief that they are justified and that we are in the right to to be critical of them, is to change that view. The whole purpose is to get away from using the mind as a weapon against oneself and against the world. That's a lot to take in. That's a major thesis. It's fundamental to the Course of Miracles. This is the central thought that the ego's worldview is built around. If healing is to be total, it must correct this error. I'll say one more thing and then open for comments, is people do attempt to heal by not addressing this issue and work more on peripheral issues, work on the outer edge without addressing this central issue. But the Course, and that can bring about some temporary relief of frictions, but if one is to totally heal this fundamental error regarding what am I? What am I doing here? What is my purpose? What is my nature? What is the meaning of life? That must be corrected if we are to be totally healed. Noelle, you had your hand up.
Yeah. The what's emphasized throughout here is, and it's in the last paragraph here too, the one fundamental error of anger. You referred to many other negative emotions,
yeah,
like and like a constellation.
Yes.
And I ask why he singles out anger rather than, for example, self-hatred, feeling of powerlessness, or feeling of being unlovable, and weakness, many others that we could list.
Right. Noelle said a constellation. It's a collection of emotions that are interconnected in one way or another. It may not be obvious that they're interconnected, but are interconnected together. And the one that they choose here, Noelle, is related to the fact that I don't know why they chose anger here, but they could have just as easily chosen other terms in that constellation. Okay, this will, by the way, this idea that Noel's suggesting is that for every word, there is a constellation of other symbols and ideas that are related to it, and you can somewhat exchange them depending on the context. If you learn that principle, you'll find reading along the Course of Miracles to be much easier rather than becoming preoccupied on a single term. Realize the term is a placeholder for the entire constellation. In another place, the Course teaches there's really only two emotions. There's love and there's fear. And so and I submit that you know instantly what constellation we're talking about. If I say anger, you know instantly that that is not a part of the constellation of love. But if I say inner peace and harmony, you know that it is a part of the constellation of love. All right, so I want to wrap up this review here and go on.
At the beginning, then, the patient's goal and the therapist's are at variance. The therapist, as well as the patient, may cherish false self-concepts, but their respective perceptions of improvement still must differ. The patient hopes to learn how to get the changes he wants without changing his self-concept to any significant extent. He hopes, in fact, to stabilize it sufficiently to include within the magical powers he seeks in psychotherapy. He wants to make the vulnerable invulnerable and the finite limitless. The self he sees is his God, and he seeks only to serve it better. Regardless of how sincere the therapist himself may be, he must want to change the patient's self-concept in some way that he believes is real. The task of therapy is one of reconciling these differences. Hopefully, both will learn to give up their original goals, for it is only in relationships that salvation can be found. At the beginning, it is inevitable that patients and therapists alike accept unrealistic goals, not completely free of magical overtones. They are finally given up in the minds of both.
So let's clarify, we are not saying that the therapist has it all figured out. That the therapist is some super god and knows all the right answers and has all the right goals. We're saying that the therapist is in this for their own healing as well. And if they're not, then they can't help anybody. That'll come out later. The therapist is themselves changing and growing and learning. And if they're not changing and growing and learning, then they're not being helpful. So the therapists both will learn to give up their original goals. Why? Because in truth, the only way real healing can become about is the experience of two minds joining together for a common purpose where love and caring and helpfulness are shared together. That's what really heals. The other aspects of the relationship are secondary or tertiary to the relationship of joining minds together. And we will pursue that in more detail in the next section. So, both therapist and patient initially have a set of goals, have a set of initial beliefs, but they're not dialed in to the perfect truth. Neither one of them is. Both of them are have undertaking a relationship that is going to transform them if they're open to the inner guidance of the spirit and of truth. So that's the foundation which leads us into our next section. And it's called the limits on psychotherapy. I think it'll become more obvious. If I didn't say so, if you do not have a copy in your book, you can find a PDF version of these materials at the following URL. Julie?
Yet the ideal outcome is rarely achieved. Therapy begins with the realization that healing is of the mind, and in psychotherapy, those have come together who already believe this. It may be they will not get much further, for no one learns beyond his own readiness. Yet levels of readiness change, and when therapist or patient has reached the next one, there will be a relationship held out to them that meets the changing need. Perhaps they will come together again and advance in the same relationship, making it holier. Or perhaps each of them will enter into another commitment. Be assured of this: each will progress. Retrogression is temporary. The overall direction is one of progress toward the truth.
Mhm. So there's a concept that is here about a readiness to change one's mind. It was introduced in the first 3 chapters of the textbook, where it says that the slogan for this course is to be ready, willing, and able to listen, learn, and do. It's part of the Foundation series, chapter 1 through 6, which we will begin next year, early next year, again, in the textbook. Readiness is readiness for change. And we should say that there are levels of readiness. And you will notice it, not to make judgments, but you will notice sometimes when people join in to the meeting, kind of wondering what is A Course of Miracles about, and you can kind of tell from their comments that they may not really be ready to change their existing thought system, that they really are more invested in holding on to their thought system. Well, that can change over time, because the one gift that the Creator has given to everyone is the power to change your own mind. But you have to be willing to change your own mind, which is what makes you ready for a change. And so no one learns beyond their own readiness at that moment in time. And so what happens in relationships is one might encounter someone that's there to help and go so far and be unwilling to go any further, and they will temporarily go away and perhaps find other relationships that are more suitable to their level of readiness. Perhaps they'll come together again and advance in the same relationships, or perhaps they will go somewhere else. This is part of the natural process. Okay, this is to be understood, that people determine for themselves how far they're willing to go at any one time. It's also true that the therapist or helper may only be able to offer so much at one time, and people might be ready for more than that, and so they might go on. All that is not to be frowned upon. And a matter of fact, be assured that each will progress, that the overall direction is one towards the truth. So this is also addressed in the teacher's manual about finding a teacher that is suitable for you at this point in your journey. And sometimes that will only be a brief association, and you'll go looking to associate with other teachers, or other times that teacher will be effective for you, and it'll be longer duration experience with it. All what we say, psychotherapist, teacher, sponsor, counselor, all these are people that are attempting to help others. And as we said before, both the helper and the helpee are in a process of healing themselves. Julie?
Psychotherapy itself cannot be creative. This is one of the errors which the ego fosters, that it is capable of true change and therefore of true creativity. When we speak of the saving illusion or the final dream, this is not what we mean, but here is the ego's last defense. Resistance is its way of looking at things, its interpretation of progress and growth. These interpretations will be wrong of necessity because they are delusional. The changes the ego seeks to make are not really changes. They are but deeper shadows, or perhaps different cloud patterns. Yet what is made of nothingness cannot be called new or different. Illusions are illusions. Truth is truth.
Mm-hmm. So let's recall again Noel's comment about a constellation of ideas, ideas cluster in similar nature. So in this regard, we're talking about resistance. It is an ego attitude towards the mind. And I'll suggest some other terms in that cluster: close-mindedness, rigid thinking, stubbornness. And I'm sure there are more. They're just not on the tip of my tongue right now. You can think of others. Do you get a sense that there's a cluster there of someone unwilling to change even when confronted with every reason to do so? Now, I know that many of you have worked in programs of recovery, and you will witness again and again people that know they need to change but are unwilling to. For in other words, they go back to their old behavior even when there's every reason to let go and move forward. Resistance is the ego's way of looking at things, and that's its interpretation of progress and growth, where it remains the ego is afraid of change. It's afraid of loss of control. And therefore, the Holy Spirit favors the opportunity for change of all sorts, because it's a chance for you to change your mind along the way and let go of the entrenched ideas of the past, or another part of the constellation. The Holy Spirit views that as a way of relinquishing those entrenched beliefs that limit us and keep us back. So that constellation will be wrong of necessity because it's delusional. It's the belief by remaining the same as it's been in the past that you are safe and better off. So just know, how can you apply this? I'm going to assert that every human being experiences this in their own thoughts to some extent, maybe not to the extremes, but somewhere along a spectrum, when it's time to change, part of the mind will be very resistant to this change, even though there might be every reason to move forward, let go of what was and adopt what is. It's about living in the present. Well, if you recognize that this is an ego defense, resistance is an ego defense, then instead of condemning yourself for that, you'll instead recognize that is an ego plot. And now I see it as such, but I'm willing to let go of that idea and be guided into the present moment. So you can apply this to your own thoughts, although I'll acknowledge many times it's easier to notice it happening in other people before you notice it happening in yourself. The course is intended for you to recognize it happening in yourself. Susie?
So yeah, you mentioned in the beginning how, we don't always start as ready, and we continue to grow as we study the course. And, I used to hear myself saying, well, that's just the way I am. And now I know, well, who's the I? And that's just, and that's just a story Susie made up. And now I know when I don't even say that anymore. But I was convinced that was true, but like I don't even say that anymore because that isn't just the way I am. That's who I've chosen to be or what I learned or whatever. And when I would say that, that would be a resistance to, want to heal and change. Now it's distasteful, some of those things. And I would rather, I prefer to give it to the Holy Spirit and have healing. And someone said to me the other day, you still have those thoughts, whatever they might be, but you don't necessarily act on them. And, I don't have some of those thoughts that I used to have anymore. I have truly been healed from some of the thinking that I used to have. The thoughts just don't even enter my mind, which is miraculous. And isn't that what it says, is a change in thinking? So anyway, that's just what came up for me. That's just the way I am, and it's, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these things that people have said for years and years and years are exactly the ego's defense mechanisms given common language and thought to be normal until we recognize that there's a distinction between ego resistance and progress.
And can I just add one last quick thing? Like, I used to say, well, that's not as bad, but there's no degrees of, so now I know it's all the same. It's love or fear. So I know now I don't judge myself. I accept it and I name it and I give it to the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Too. All right, we'll go on.
Resistance, as defined here, can be characteristic of a therapist as well as of a patient. Either way, it sets a limit on psychotherapy because it restricts its aims. Nor can the Holy Spirit fight against the intrusions of the ego on the therapeutic process, but he will wait, and his patience is infinite. His goal is wholly undivided, always. Whatever resolutions patient and therapist reach in connection with their own divergent goals, they cannot become completely reconciled as one until they join with his. Only then is all conflict over, for only then can there be certainty.
So we're talking about the individual, whether it be the helper or the helpee, being resistant to change. And always the Holy Spirit will not intrude, will not violate your will by initiating a change on you unwillingly. It's a principle of free will here. So in order for there to be complete healing, we're talking about a relationship, both members cannot become completely reconciled as one until they're willing to join with the Holy Spirit's plan for a more comprehensive healing. So what are we saying here? We know that people enter into therapy sometimes with very specific goals in mind. They can label, like tell you exactly why they're there. And all that is fine as a starting point, but the Holy Spirit's plan for healing is all encompassing of every aspect of one's life and of everyone. And so, however one gets started on the healing journey, the Holy Spirit is in it for the long run and has infinite patience and is willing to wait until the individual is ready. Remember, we talked about readiness, ready to change their mind. And so healing is going to come in waves of letting go old beliefs about the self, resistances, defenses, closed-mindedness, false beliefs are going to, a lot of people use layers of the onion as a metaphor for layers and layers that have to be released and forgiven for healing to occur. Julie?
Ideally, psychotherapy is a series of holy encounters in which brothers meet to bless each other and to receive the peace of God. And this will one day come to pass for every patient on the face of this earth. For who except a patient could possibly have come here? The therapist is only a somewhat more specialized teacher of God. He learns through teaching, and the more advanced he is, the more he teaches and the more he learns. But whatever stage he is in, there are patients who need him just that way. They cannot take more than he can give for now, yet both will find sanity at last.
Mm-hmm. So notice in this paragraph, which is the end of this subsection here, we're talking about in the ideal case, psychotherapy is a series of holy encounters. So we're talking about higher functioning where both helper and helpee have let go of their initial self-appointed goals and are now here open to the guidance of the Holy Spirit towards a higher level of joining, which we call a holy encounter in the Course of Miracles. And this is the same holy encounter, holy relationship that were spoken about in chapters 15 through 18 of the textbook. Those holy encounters would be the ideal form, and that can occur very quickly. Let's see, what am I trying to say? arriving at that stage of holy encounter is not determined by time. It's determined by readiness and willingness. It seems often to take a lot of time because the releasing our resistance and defense and clutching the old self-concepts and goals, people take their time doing those things. But if you are willing to let all that go today, it would happen instantly. And thus you'd have a holy instant, a holy encounter right away. And so this is the end of this subsection. We're going to transition now on to the next section. Noelle, you had your hand up.
Maybe I'm anticipating the next section,
Mhm.
but to read so far, I would imagine that at least the therapist would have to be a student of the course or something similar. But I know that's not true because there have been a lot of wonderful outcomes from the therapist-patient relationship, and I am one of them. And so it leads me to think that even in a more generalized way,
Mhm.
when he says the Holy Spirit and when he says holy encounter, he's really referring to the development and exchange of love
Mhm.
between them.
Yes. 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 You're right, Noel. Although we are talking within the context of A Course in Miracles, the truth is far more broad. Healing did not begin in 1975 when The Course in Miracles was published. It began long ago. As a matter of fact, the example that immediately comes to mind is sometimes children have a wonderful, loving relationship with their grandparents. They go visit grandmom and granddad, and they have all this energy and attention that they have for them. It's a loving relationship where the wisdom and the graciousness of the grandparents, the child has a chance to experience what that's like. I'm talking more in the ideal case here. That would be a holy encounter. That's healing. And it doesn't need to be amongst blood kin. It can be in many other forms. But as you said, Noel, it's about loving relationships where one is changed and transformed by the very spirit of the relationship itself, that you want to rise up into your better self and let go of past self concepts. Susie?
Yeah, I was just going to say that word. So it says a somewhat more specialized teacher of God, right? So it's someone, and I've had this experience with Heather, who knew that I wasn't my self-concept.
Yes.
And she was more advanced than me. And she had that. She had that, knowledge. Truth is true. Illusions are illusions. She knew I was living in an illusion, and she directed me to the course. So she was, one who believed beyond self-concepts. So, who learned through teaching and whatever. I just think it's, really obvious for me, or apparent for me, not, that it's someone who doesn't believe that, that helps us to know that we're not who we are stories.
Right.
Yeah. And, that's important because I talks a lot about it in the text, right? Not to get involved with my story and make my story bigger. And oh my God, I have PTSD and I was blah, 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 blah. You know what I'm saying, Jonica.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to put in, let's take this out of the context we're familiar with. In in centuries ago, people used to live in small villages, and there was a strong sense of community. They shared in food and tools and language and stories, and there was often a wise man or a wise woman in the village who just was able to be very helpful to other people because of their understanding and their insights. This relationship transcends cultures, locations, time, space. It transcends degrees and certificates. It's more universal, more fundamental. And the only thing that is required is two people come together for a shared purpose, and that evolves to the point where they're willing to have spirit guide that relationship. And then it takes on transcendent properties. So maybe that's a good lead in to the next section, which is really, I think, the main section for this session today, the place of religion in psychotherapy. And you might say, well, I didn't know it had a place. Well, open your mind to looking at this in an entirely different light, not in the conventional ways that our world has defined, but through the lens that the Holy Spirit would invite you to look at.
To be a teacher of God, it is not necessary to be religious or even to believe in God to any recognizable extent. It is necessary, however, to teach forgiveness rather than condemnation. Even in this, complete consistency is not required, for one who had achieved that point could teach salvation completely, within an instant and without a word. Yet he who has learned all things does not need a teacher, and the healed have no need for a therapist. Relationships are still the temple of the Holy Spirit, and they will be made perfect in time and restored to eternity.
So there's a lot said right here that might not be expected. To be a teacher of God is not even necessary to believe in God to any recognizable extent. But one does have to be willing to teach forgiveness rather than condemnation. And so now we've just universalized this relationship of helper and helpee to way beyond conventional concepts of that might couch things in terms of religious terms. What's really necessary is one be willing to let go of all past criticisms, judgments, guilt, and teach forgiveness rather than condemnation. That opens the door for a holy encounter, a relationship that has properties that are not fully conscious to you or I when we're in them. A relationship, we typically are conscious of our ego to ego encounters, my mind and your mind. But at the same time, in a relationship, the higher self of each person also is encountering the other person. And it would be the goal of this course to make that higher self more conscious so that you are aware of it. That's what healing is you become aware of your higher self and conscious of that, as well as of the other person, and not only aware of your lower ego mind. So, what are we really saying? Where is the temple of the Holy Spirit? Wherever two or more are joined together in a common purpose.
Formal religion has no place in psychotherapy, but it also has no real place in religion. In this world, there is an astonishing tendency to join contradictory words into one term without perceiving the contradiction at all. The attempt to formalize religion is so obviously an ego attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable that it hardly requires elaboration here. Religion is experience. Psychotherapy is experience. At the highest levels, they become one. Neither is truth itself, but both can lead to truth. What can be necessary to find truth, which remains perfectly obvious, but to remove the seeming obstacles to true awareness?
So the Holy Spirit does all this reinterpretation of the symbols and language that we're familiar with. So here's one: formal religion. Remember the constellation we mentioned earlier around resistance and stubbornness and closed-mindedness? And, well, what is formalized religion? It's crystallized and hardened into a creed and a doctrine that doesn't change for hundreds or thousands of years. It's stuck in the past. It's unwilling to change. And so they refer to that as a contradiction. So what's really being saying is that formal religion, which is stuck in the past, has no place in psychotherapy or even in spirituality. Both of them, in the true sense of the word, true religion and true psychotherapy are both experiences, and they have a range over that experience from lower to higher. At the higher levels, they become one. They are not in and of themselves the truth, but they can lead to the truth. And that's what I would really emphasize as the most essential factor, is that direction one is headed towards the truth matters more than what you might think of as where am I along the journey. The most important thing is, are you headed in the right direction?
No one who learns to forgive can fail to remember God. Forgiveness, then, is all that need be taught, because it is all that need be learned. All blocks to the remembrance of God are forms of unforgiveness and nothing else. This is never apparent to the patient and only rarely so to the therapist. The world has marshaled all its forces against this one awareness, for in it lies the ending of the world and all it stands for.
This is very deep. This applies to everyone practicing the Course in Miracles, but it also applies to everyone, everywhere. So we assert this is a universal truth, and the context here is that you were created by the creator, and your relationship with the creator is forever a part of you, but that memory of your relationship to the creator in all creation has been momentarily or temporarily forgotten, and other notions rush in, illusions, to take their place. Here it says all blocks to the remembrance of God are forms of unforgiveness, which can be interpreted as all blocks are forms of clutching to the illusions instead of letting them go and relinquishing them, emptying the mind of all those false notions of self and of the world, and allowing what is already deeply embedded within you, the eternal truth, to reemerge. So all of that is forms of unforgiveness and nothing else. As unapparent as that may be to you and I, the truth remains within us all, but is temporarily obscured by all manner of illusions, the chief of which is the fundamental error that we talked about earlier, the notion of what am I? Julie?
Thanks, Jonica. I was thinking earlier in the class tonight that for me, the reason why anger is such a great example is because it's something usually amongst either two or more people, even if the identified patient can't recognize their anger, it's often recognizable in at least one of two other people that are present in a session of contact, be it in person or even by mail or whatever. And so I think the other examples that were given, for me, they're not so easily recognizable by me when I'm already convinced that I'm right. But someone pointing out to me the details about how it is that I appear angry is pretty hard to dispute. At least I've had my denial dismantled in that example plenty of times. So anyhow, and that for me just it's meaningful in this situation, thinking about blocks to the remembrance of God. Certainly anger and feeling that I'm right about something is a big one.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up about anger, because I think Noelle asked about why was that word used earlier. As you were sharing, Julia, I was thinking in terms of the constellation around anger, and what immediately came to mind is anger, hostility, frustration, judgment, guilt, opposition. Well, all of that is fear-based responses to another. And as we know, our brothers are mirrors of ourselves. And so all that really is an expression of self-concept, poor self-concept, ego self-concept. And so yeah, this idea of thank you again, Noelle, for bringing up the constellation. It is taught within A Course in Miracles. It may only be used once or twice as a term. The idea of thinking in terms of a constellation of ideas, rather than limit ourselves to one word and all of what that might imply. Realize that there are other symbols that can be used in that constellation, and it becomes a lot easier to understand the meaning.
Yet it is not the awareness of God that constitutes a reasonable goal for psychotherapy. This will come when psychotherapy is complete. For where there is forgiveness, truth must come. It would be unfair indeed if belief in God were necessary to psychotherapeutic success. Nor is belief in God a really meaningful concept, for God can be but known. Belief implies that unbelief is possible, but knowledge of God has no true opposite. Not to know God is to have no knowledge, and it is to this that all unforgiveness leads. And without knowledge, one can have only belief.
So I think this does require a little interpretation. But one, let's just be clear that psychotherapy, the goal isn't awareness of God in psychotherapy. It's to release the fundamental error in the mind about oneself and therefore oneself in relationship to others and to the world. It's to undo the problem, which is the first step towards total healing. It would be unfair if belief in God were necessary for a psychotherapeutic process, because now hold your horses. Belief in God is not really a meaningful concept. Belief in God is a mental construct. I've got constructed a set of ideas in my mind that I'm holding on to that tell me there is a God. That's simply a construct in my mind that has no more meaning than any other construct in the mind. What the Course teaches is that God, it's a relationship that we have with God, not an intellectual construct of Him. This is not typically the way it's done. All over the world, people have constructs. That affect in many religious organizations, there's a list of statements of what they believe to be true about God. And it says, you can belong to this congregation if you support these beliefs. So we're saying in the conventional Orthodox sense, people are very invested in beliefs, constructs. But the truth is that there is a relationship with the Creator, and you can only that relationship ultimately is based not on your constructs, but of your experiences in that relationship. Its constructs constantly change, whereas your experience in a relationship remain with you forever. And so there's really no, I know this is a bit abstract, and perhaps some of you, this might be new. This is found in many, many parts of the Course of Miracles, that beliefs will fix your mind on a set of statements, whereas an experience frees your mind in a way that is not limited by a set of statements. Susie?
So I have an example that helps me with this. There could be a belief that I would love my mom, or that we love our parents or whatever, but I know I can't explain it, but I know I have knowledge. I know I love my mom. And for me, it's kind of the same kind of thing we're talking about, sort of.
Mhm.
So and it's hard to explain what that knowledge is, right? It's hard to put that relationship into words to know God. It's hard to put I can't put it to words what it is to love my mother. I'm just using that as an example.
Yes.
So that might be helpful for someone. I don't know. It was helpful for me.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And you might notice in part two of the workbook, they signal that there's a shift from part one, which is very centered on the words and the statements, getting your mind into a new pattern of thoughts in part one. And then in part two, it says words will mean little now. We want to strive for an experience beyond words. And so this is all a part of the real depth of the Course of Miracles, is that you would have an experience of these things, not just a set of thoughts and beliefs about them. It begins perhaps with changing your mind, your thoughts, and your beliefs about letting go old beliefs, but it does not end in just simply a new set of beliefs. It instead moves on to an actual spiritual experience with these realities. Sandra?
Yeah, my experience with this is that I did not have a point of reference for love.
Yeah.
Um, but I just love this book because coming in to study this book, I I began to understand that God was defining who I am, not my parents, not my children, not anybody but God. And so then I just started to hang out with God. I would meditate. I sat, I walked, I did the Course in Miracles on a daily basis. I studied for hours, and God just became part of it's just part of me, just part of everything. And I mean, I'm listening to those lessons every minute of the day because my life depends on it. And I do this course like my life depends on it. And God is just part of who I am. It's just, I'm constantly talking to God and it's working. I'm complete.
Thank you. That's a beautiful testimony to the experience of sharing your daily life with God. All right, I'm noticing my time here. I know this is running a little long, so I'm going to pick up a little bit here so we finish on time.
Different teaching aids appeal to different people. Some forms of religion have nothing to do with God, and some forms of psychotherapy have nothing to do with healing. Yet if pupil and teacher join in sharing one goal, God will enter into their relationship because he has been invited to come in. In the same way, a union of purpose between patient and therapist restores the place of God to ascendance, first through Christ's vision, and then through the memory of God himself. The process of psychotherapy is return to sanity. Teacher and pupil, therapist and patient are all insane, or they would not be here. Together, they can find a pathway out, for no one will find sanity alone.
The point I want to emphasize here is the essential basis for a relationship is when pupil and teacher, helper and helpee join in sharing one goal, then that is, their minds come together for a common purpose, then God will enter into that relationship because you've chosen to unite yourself with another. It does not matter what the goal is. It does not have to be overtly religious or high-minded at all. It can be around helping a person with a flat tire, something as mundane as changing a tire it doesn't matter the form in which it takes. What matters is that all parties unite together, working with each other towards that goal. Julie?
If healing is an invitation to God to enter into his kingdom, what difference does it make how the invitation is written? Does the paper matter, or the ink, or the pen? Or is it he who writes that gives the invitation? God comes to those who would restore his world, for they have found the way to call him. If any two are joined, he must be there. It does not matter what their purpose is, but they must share it wholly to succeed. It is impossible to share a goal not blessed by Christ, for what is unseen through his eyes is too fragmented to be meaningful.
So this is an extension of what we just read. Two people coming together to share one goal. It does not matter what their purpose is, but they must share it wholly to succeed. They must be wholehearted together in uniting around that goal. You can use this. You can feel the way it feels to unite together with another person for a common purpose. You don't even need to know their name, but when it happens, it has a potency to it that is beyond words. It's beyond words. Yeah, many different forms this can take. It's impossible to share a goal that is not blessed by Christ.
As true religion heals, so must true psychotherapy be religious. Both have many forms because no good teacher uses one approach to every pupil. On the contrary, he listens patiently to each one and lets him formulate his own curriculum, not the curriculum's goal, but how he can best reach the aim it sets for him. Perhaps the teacher does not think of God as part of teaching. Perhaps the psychotherapist does not understand that healing comes from God. They can succeed where many who believe they have found God will fail.
Mm-hmm. So some of what is being said here in these final few paragraphs in this section perhaps are more applicable to someone that's actively engaged in helping others. Again, there are many approaches that can be used. In fact, and this is the more art of healing, the helper listens patiently to each pupil and lets the pupil formulate his own path, not but not formulate the goal, but formulates his own path towards the goal. Let's speak of the opposite. Opposite of that would be where the teacher tries to control the actual details of how the pupil unfolds their healing path. It's trying to exert too heavy of a hand on the pupil. The aware teacher trusts that the pupil will find his way as long as the direction is correct. He listens patiently to and lets the pupil formulate his own goal, but I'm sorry, lets the pupil formulate his own path, his own curriculum, but not the goal. So again, these are more if you're involved in some forms of guiding other people, these lessons become increasingly useful in those applications.
What must the teacher do to ensure learning? What must the therapist do to bring healing about? Only one thing. The same requirement salvation asks of everyone. Each one must share one goal with someone else, and in so doing, lose all sense of separate interests. Only by doing this is it possible to transcend the narrow boundaries the ego would impose upon the self. Only by doing this can teacher and pupil, therapist and patient, you and I, accept atonement and learn to give it as it was received.
Mm-hmm. This paragraph really will give you insight into what happens when you share one goal with another person. And there's two sides of that coin. It's the what would serve as an obstacle to progress, and then there's the other side of what actual progress looks like. The obstacle to progress is where two people come together and they keep their own sense of separate interest. I have my interest, you have your interest, and we're competing or bargaining to find some intermediate place. That keeps the ego identity, its structure in place during that encounter. What it looks like in a healing encounter is one, even if it's only for the moment, one becomes permeable with regards to their sense of self-interest and is able to unite with the other person in a common goal for in that experience. Doesn't mean forever, but during that encounter, one drops the rigid barriers that the ego sets up, and unites with the other person so that you transcend the narrow boundaries the ego would impose upon the self. I have noticed, so I live in South Florida. Hurricanes are a part of the experience here. And we've had a number of drills over the last couple decades. And that often is life-threatening, or would seem to be life-threatening, storm coming at 150 miles an hour towards you. And I have noticed neighbors coming together in ways that transcend the narrow boundaries the ego would impose upon the self. People helping people to survive. You can see examples of this right now in North Carolina, where they're going to be struggling to recover for years and years and years. People coming together in I'm not saying everywhere, but you can see examples of where people come together to help other people, where they share a goal with someone else, and they do so, they lose sense of self-interest, where they donate food and clothing and tools and equipment and their time, their labor to help someone they don't even know. And so the point here is that these things take many forms, whether you're preparing for a hurricane or you're recovering after a hurricane, or even if while you're out shopping, someone falls and injures themselves, and you give of your time to help them get whatever help they need. It's not the form that matters, it's the transcending the narrow boundaries the ego impose upon the self. And that's where you find your true self. Um, I want to say this one more way. Um, in my life, I've volunteered for 29 different organizations over the course of my entire life. That's where I found my true self. I mean, at work, I got paid and I had an identity there. But what I really found my value system and what people mean to me was in volunteering, because that forced me into situations that transcended the narrow boundaries that my ego imposed upon myself. And so the forms in which you do these things matter not. What matters is that you have some kind of encounter with another where you come together for a common purpose. It, my own experiences, it's been life changing and continues to be so to this day.
Communion is impossible alone. No one who stands apart can receive Christ's vision. It is held out to him, but he cannot hold out his hand to receive it. Let him be still and recognize his brother's need is his own. And let him then meet his brother's need as his, and see that they are met as one, for such they are. What is religion but an aid in helping him to see that this is so? And what is psychotherapy except a help in just this same direction? It is the goal that makes these processes the same, for they are one in purpose and must thus be one in means.
So now we've joined it all together. All of these different forms of helping others, lending a hand, counseling, sponsoring, fellow travel, coaching, teaching, therapists, ministers. It goes on and on and on. Different roles, different labels we give to this constellation of people helping people. All of them, the goal is shared purpose makes these processes the same, for they're one in purpose and therefore must be one in means. And when we do that, we invite God in, and in the process, we transcend the narrow boundaries that the ego has established for ourselves. And nothing could be more progressive than to find yourself in a situation with others where your former self is transcended and you awaken to aspects of your true self that you might not otherwise have found so quickly. Communion, it is true, communion is impossible alone. Well, that thou puts pupil, teacher, helper, helpee, psychotherapist, patient, all that ties together and means that we, in this context, we are all psychotherapists. We are all teachers and pupils. We are all both learners and teachers at the same time. And so it's a journey. And the goal of this curriculum is to accelerate the time at which it takes to learn these principles. And so I think we made some progress towards that today. I know this was a lot in one session. I kind of feel like maybe I could have cut it in half and that might have been better, but I'm learning too and have to put these things out there and see how it goes. So I thank you for your patience and your endurance with these matters. We'll continue with the next section in this, which is the role of the psychotherapist, because each of us are helpers and psychotherapists. We want to understand our part in this role. We'll continue with that in our next session. So I thank you all and honor you. Thank you, Julie, for reading. Namaste, my friends.
Thank you, Julie. Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone. Thanks, John. Again.
Namaste, everyone. Thank you.
Love you all. Bye.
Peace
everyone.
and love.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.